This shot shows a close-up of an electronics circuit board. Shown is a 20-pin integrated circuit mounted to a circuit board. On the reverse side of the circuit board is the solder connections between the circuit board pads and that of the pins of the integrated circuit. Set up for removal of the integrated circuit by laying out the equipment of the solder iron, the solder removal wick, the chip puller, and the electronic solder. Cut the solder wick to a length of about 6 to 8 inches. On the underside of the circuit board, lay the solder wick along one side of the IC's pin connections. Add heat to the solder wick with the solder iron to draw the solder from the pin and the pad into the braid of the solder wick. Practice is needed to get the temperature of the solder iron right. Not enough temperature and you spend too much time on the board, which can damage the IC and printed circuit board. Too high of a temperature and the solder boils away and the high heat damages the board. The solder wick will transfer the heat to the solder connecting the pin and pad. Once the solder melts, it will run to the surface that is hotter. In this case, the wire braid of the solder wick acts like a sponge to absorb the solder as it melts. As the solder wick fills with solder, move the fresh braid of the solder wick into its place to absorb the remaining solder. Finish the bottom solder removal for both sides of the IC chip using the solder wick. Use the solder wick and heat to remove any solder on the top side of the IC chip. This will allow for the removal of the IC chip. When all the solder is removed, the chip puller can be used to pry the integrated circuit off the board. Place the replacement IC into place on the circuit board with all the pins going through the correct holes. Press the chip into place, making sure there is no movement. Use a blade screwdriver to push the pins on the underside to one side so contact is made with the pad of the circuit board. Dab the solder paste or flux onto the underside of the IC with a brush where the chip pins will touch the pads. This will clean the surfaces when heated with the iron and improve the flow of solder between the pin and pad surfaces. With the underside of the IC facing up and the chip held in, place the solder iron tip in contact with the pin and pad to transfer heat. This will boil the flux to clean the pin and pad surfaces in preparation for the flow of the solder between the two metal surfaces. Place the solder wire tip in contact with the metal pad and pin. When the metal temperature reaches the melting point of the solder, it will form a puddle on a pad around the pin. Remove the heat instantly. Continue soldering the rows on both sides of the IC chip until complete. Inspect the top side of the pin and pad soldering to make sure no contact is happening between the pins.